After my first playthrough of Modern Warfare 2019, I was positive that it was easily one of the best Call of Duty games. But that was before I played through all of the others again for this series. I was initially only intending to review this game, and I was going to look at every mode. But with the Spec Ops mode having so many issues at launch, and multiplayer being a mode that's in a constant state of flux, I just wasn't that interested in doing such a thing. But it did ignite a curiosity to see if it really was so much stronger than most of the rest of the series, so I replayed them all, and with them all fresh in my mind, I can now see the threads that led to this point much clearer. Some of the things that felt so fantastic in Modern Warfare 2019 were suddenly revealed to be old ideas in one way or another, with a new coat of paint on top of them to freshen them up. Now that it's all said and done though, what do I think of Modern Warfare 2019? I still think it's easily one of the best Call of Duty games, but for slightly different reasons. Initially, I really loved this game for the impact its story beats had on me, with its emphasis on characters. I loved it for its set pieces and ideas that felt like they were brand new to the series. I loved it for risks I thought it took in level and encounter design. All of these things were sprinkled throughout the other titles, though, in one form or another, and here and there I can definitely say these ideas were done just as well, if not a little better in said other titles. But what was missing from all of these titles other than Infinite Warfare was the sheer mechanical polish and focus Modern Warfare has, the impeccable gameplay pacing, and the culmination of many of the best ideas the series has tried up to this point. Previously, all of these shining lights were scattered, but here they've been brought together to create a strong, shining whole. So once again, let's blaze through the basics. Modern Warfare 2019 has no issues with flinch. I didn't have any issues with infinitely spawning enemies, nor excess explosives. Same with Last Stand. This game feels like I wish Modern Warfare 1 and 2 did. They also gave you infinite sprint again, just like Black Ops 3. Though this time you can double tap the sprint button to enter a sort of super sprint, which has a very short duration and needs to be used tactically. The slide is back, which I really appreciate, because it's once again really effective. Mounting weapons now replaces the contextual lean, and it's an insanely useful addition. Where the contextual lean could sometimes not function particularly well, and sacrificed player agency for a bit of safety while aiming, mounting functions nearly flawlessly, and instead affords the player agency, extra accuracy, and safety at the cost of reaction time and agility. I used this constantly, and it has a transformative effect on the gameplay. What's more though, is that it pushes the player to think more strategically, rather than just rushing corridors, popping shots at whatever moves, and then moving back to heal. This is probably one of my favorite mechanical additions in the series, which is crazy considering how simple it is. Not to mention how dead set I was on every Call of Duty going forward, stealing Rainbow Six Siege's lean function because I thought it was objectively the best for console shooters. This serves a slightly different purpose, but is just as good as Rainbow Six's lean. It also feels like enemy accuracy is related directly to what actions you're taking, further prioritizing swift but tactical decision making. It seems like sprinting makes you less likely to get hit, with super sprint lowering that chance even further. Same with sliding and mounting, but punishments for just running around and shooting stuff from out in the open are large. I love the strategy this asks of you, while not slowing down the action like you would find in something like a Rainbow Six title. Tons and tons of doors have been added in Modern Warfare as well. Unlike Infinite Warfare, you can now shoot through many of them, as well as shoulder bash them open to surprise enemies or even knock them down. Unfortunately, you can't peek doors anymore or toss grenades while peeking, since your only alternative to bashing them open is to open them normally. This is less than a straight negative though, and more like an even trade, a horizontal sidestep from what Infinite Warfare did. Presentation here is also phenomenal. Graphically, this is another massive step forward, the first I'd argue since Advanced Warfare released. In particular, the sound design and the animations are some of the best in the industry, hands down. It absolutely blows my mind that the gun animations are all hand animated from scratch rather than motion capture, because they're outstanding. Levels themselves are also really varied, well-paced, and offer a focus on core gameplay rather than shiny set pieces. In fact, most of the set pieces are rather subdued, like this one where everyone is low on ammo and you only have a handful of mortar flares to light up the fields ahead, where an army of enemies is attempting to rush you. Or there's this section, where you're left to your own devices as you try to plant explosives on 2 helicopters to create a distraction. Special mention goes to the cool little bit of aesthetic creativity in letting the player use oil filters from vehicles as silencers. Everyone has already talked on and on about the absolute genius of the Clean House mission, as well as how great the night vision emulation looks. There's also a section where you're going through a hospital that's full of enemy insurgents when things quiet down as you enter a section with a ton of bodies on beds. Some of these people seem to still be alive, some of them seem to be civilians, and some of them seem to be terrorists that were getting treatment. The player now has to worry about the potential for one of them to be faking their injuries to mount a surprise attack. The Piccadilly stage is also fantastic because it's a chaotic mess of civilians and enemies that makes picking your shots an incredibly intense affair. I could honestly go on and on. I loved so many of the sections of this game. There's even another expansion on the freeform stealth level that they've been toying with for the last few games, and it's grander and more open than ever. Truly marvelous. I'd say probably the weakest bit for me was the first part of the mission where you play as young Farah, because the goofy game of hide and seek against this cartoonish Russian psychopath was simply something I couldn't take seriously. Tone down the look of the guy and the evil villain nonsense he spouts while looking for you, and make it so that I don't have to repeatedly sneak up and stab him like he's a Zelda boss, and it would have felt much less out of place. It's also interesting that there are several moments strewn throughout where the player is expected to die from a trap their first time through and learn a lesson from it. It's not that you can't see them coming, but rather that you're unlikely to. While I'd normally be against this, because of the way I was playing the game, they felt less like trolly beginner's traps and more like ways for the developers to further push the idea that even just a single moment of lapsed judgment in a soldier can lead to danger or death for them and others. It only further pushed me to play more methodically. Just goes to show that context really can make a huge difference for how an idea that would traditionally be considered bad game design is experienced. Beyond all of this, realistic difficulty is back, presumably as a replacement for a specialist from Infinite Warfare. You know, considering spamming magic healing syringes and surviving several headshots because of a basic helmet would probably clash with the relative realism Modern Warfare's gameplay is shooting for. But instead of just dying in one hit from superhuman machines like in Black Ops 3, realistic here is simply veteran but without the HUD elements. While I think some of the HUD elements should have remained purely for user experience purposes, it is fun to have things like ammo counts be missing. But the most important thing about it is that veteran level difficulty balancing isn't nonsense this time around. You can still take a shot or two more than you could on previous versions of veteran, and enemies aren't using aimbots. In fact, they only feel marginally more aware than on regular, and considering they already felt pretty naturally aware and accurate on regular, this has a transformative effect on how playable veteran and realistic are. I greatly enjoyed what it offered, even if I still kind of prefer specialist mode. With that out of the way, we unfortunately have to touch on the controversy surrounding the story. Modern Warfare billed itself as a serious game tackling serious topics, a game about war awash in gray, with no easy right answers. But for some insanely strange reason, it's also a game that was repeatedly cited as being apolitical. Now, I liked this story. As a human being, as an individual independent from the critic, I really loved most of this story. Once again, largely because of the characters. This story brought me to tears several times, because whether the actual events throughout are real or not, and whether or not it deserves criticism for warping real events to create a seeming propaganda piece about the supposed valiant heroism and perfection of Western military forces, the human cost of warfare is still presented in a way that's much more raw, direct, and compassionate than the series has really gotten. Infinite Warfare got to me because the characters felt human. Modern Warfare 2019 got to me because I knew a lot of the core brutality and costs of war presented throughout are realities people face every day of their lives. Every minute I sat there playing this game in relative comfort and safety, real people were dying or dealing with the loss of loved ones. Real people were being treated like criminals for fighting for their freedom. Real countries are being torn apart thanks to the hubris of politicians who exercise their power to toy with the lives of others, and thanks to the ignorance of those across the world who are too busy to give a shit. I understand the game's story isn't perfect, and there are a lot of arguably ignorant choices it made for the sake of entertainment. But I also can't deny the way it made me feel and the thoughts it had me pondering while I played. Maybe that's because I'm smart enough to understand that many of our leaders treat military force like a toy, so I would never assume that our hands are clean, or that the ends always justify the means. It didn't warp my perception of reality like so many fear it could with its misinformation, but maybe I'm the exception. Look, the developers have given their thoughts about how political this game is, which I sympathize with. But if we're honest, I believe that calling it apolitical is their way to avoid scaring off the consumers who are genuinely dumb enough to believe that simply saying something isn't political means it's not political. You know, the type of people who think politics don't belong in games. The type of people whose understanding of games and their themes literally stop at Metal Gear 2 is dumb because Raiden is gay, and Metal Gear Solid 3 is cool because Snake is a badass, bro. The type of utter idiots who firmly believe Metal Gear isn't political. I don't agree with bowing down to those people. Fuck them. But I don't agree with the developers either. Call of Duty is political, and that's a large part of its potential value. It literally cannot not be political. There is no escaping that with clever language. Nobody involved in the production of these games should be afraid of that. My favorite thing about Call of Duty 4 and about the new Modern Warfare today, aside from the strides they make for their specific brand of first-person shooter, is the stuff that's political. That's what moved me, in spite of its problems. So here, I want to take a bit of time to talk about the places where the game affected me. That does not mean these bits are free of issues. Rather, I simply don't want the positive things I experienced to be lost in the overwhelmingly negative discussion. So firstly, I've heard some people argue that the game has no teeth, because you aren't given real choice at a lot of key points. But what they disregard is that a lack of choice can often say the most in a given context. The perfect example for me in Modern Warfare is the point where the Butcher has a man and a child hostage just behind a locked, bulletproof glass door. He kills the man and then threatens to kill the boy if you don't open the door and let his forces through. If you open the door, he immediately kills you, leading to a game over. Similar to the white phosphorus section in Spec Ops: The Line, this is a mechanical option that presents a false choice. The illusion of a choice, but lack of real control, is intended to illustrate the complexity of the situation. That falls apart if the player just has the option to gun everyone down and play the hero like it's Gears of War. The key difference people often fail to bring up, though, is that Spec Ops intentionally frames all of your real choices as wrong no matter what you do, because it's a commentary on violence in games, the effects of nationalistic patriotism, humanity, and PTSD in military personnel. Spec Ops: The Line is trying to clearly state that all of the choices you make in the game are wrong, whether you actually have a real choice or not. By contrast, Modern Warfare is trying to illustrate that these choices are instead complicated and gray. If you open that door and you die, life ends for that soldier, and they've accomplished nothing but putting more people in danger. In trying to make the moral choice and save the kid, they're dead. Game over. So instead, when both morality and practicality are at odds with each other, Modern Warfare is asking which is more valuable, the moral choice or the practical choice. I can't really see a better way to present this question in the context of this encounter. Let's say you could instead open the door, the kid died anyway, but you could gun down all the enemies. Well, in this case, there's no choice of morality versus practicality. It's practicality versus impracticality. You're spending bullets and putting yourself in danger, or not spending them and staying safe, because the kid dies either way. But what if you were given the option to open the door and heroically save the kid instead? Well, thanks to game design concessions to make games playable, this is also not a meaningful choice. Suddenly, the best route is clearly morality. You save the kid because it's a video game, and honestly, what threat do a dozen enemy combatants pose against your video game superpowers? This is the exact same issue that would arise if Spec Ops allowed the player to avoid using the white phosphorus, because we all know that AI army doesn't really stand a chance against your human intelligence and recharging health. Such an option would devalue the ideas that such a segment are trying to instill in the player. So similar to Modern Warfare, if you actually try to gun down this army in Spec Ops, you realize it's an unwinnable battle with infinite enemies. This is effectively the same type of false choice, but framed differently for different thematic purposes. Sure, these games could instead make players start the entire game over or something as punishment for trying the moral route and failing. After all, you tried to be the hero and now your soldier is dead. Permanently. So you arguably don't deserve to try again from the last checkpoint. That would indeed be a more effective solution that drives the same point home. Let them try, fail, and then feel the sting of that failure. But in game design terms, for a mass-market AAA experience, that's impractical. Is that the COD you actually want to play? What this illustrates to me is that the developers themselves didn't really have a choice they could make here. You let the player watch as the kid is killed, and let them know that they can't do anything about it, no matter how hard they try. You then ask them what that says about the humanity of the individuals that didn't stop such an atrocity. Ask them how effective it really is to excuse practical inaction when it flies in the face of morality. I really don't think that this is the equivalent of saying nothing, as some people have claimed, and while I can see the undertones potentially glorifying the Western super soldier image, again, that's not at all what I saw. The larger picture this discussion is framed within deals with how the game wants us to see characters like Price and Gaz. As I said, there's a very real argument that they intended us to see them as valiant heroes that do what needs to be done, even if it crosses the line. Why? Because it saves lives and prevents further war. But once again, I didn't personally get this impression. When Gaz is fuming at the end of the first mission and mentions how he wanted to take the gloves off and fight on his own terms, doing whatever it takes to get the job done, I didn't see this as a statement of superior thought coming from the developers. Instead, I saw the same general line of questioning I illustrated above. How far is too far? What actually justifies things like torture or the scarring of innocents to save others? Do the ends actually always justify the means? Up to this point, Price is portrayed as the guy who will always make the hard choices if it means a better overall outcome. To him, the cost is never too great until it leaves you with less than the alternative choice. This all comes together in the section where you're interrogating the Butcher later on. The idea presented to Gaz and the player is, well, Price is willing to do whatever it takes. Are you? No, are you really? Or did you just puff up your chest and say empty words? Yes, obviously we know after the fact that if Gaz's team had been allowed to act, the terrorist attack at the beginning of the game could have been stopped. But where do you draw the line without the benefit of hindsight? Gaz himself more or less asks this in the cutscene where they're driving later on. What really constitutes crossing a line? Is it the one who's in charge that makes the difference? The supposed moral high ground you believe yourself to be standing on? The comparative lengths your enemies are going to stop you? I've seen the argument made that in the eyes of the game, the answer is, when the ones doing the dirty work are on your side, it's always justified. But considering Gaz's trepidation and how the game treats the interrogation scene by allowing the player to go softer on the Butcher and his family, or even allowing the player to skip it entirely, I once again didn't feel this way. When Gaz was talking at the beginning, I wasn't completely on board with what he was saying. Again, his team being allowed to act could have stopped the attack. We know that after the fact. But his words were also reminiscent of the sort of things I heard people saying to justify invading Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s, actions that have only further destabilized that region and in many uncountable ways caused immeasurable suffering for both people in those countries and people across the globe. It felt like an obvious indication that things aren't as simple as his emotional outburst implies, and that's something he has to learn. I think what the game lacks is a true opposition between these ideas. Farah is in a sense the opposite of Price, where Hadir is his mirror image. Farah plays by the rules of morality and humanity first. She's compassionate. Price and Hadir get shit done, and justify a lack of humanity as a way to further their goals, with Hadir being the live long enough to see yourself become the villain side of that coin. But Farah never really pulls Gaz in the direction opposite of Price, despite Price pulling him closer to his mindset. She does present these ideas to the player, but not really to Gaz. Some people are under the impression that just because Price's build is one of the heroes of the story, that means he must stand for the moral good in the eyes of the writers. But I think he stands more for the practical good, for as much as that means. Farah is by contrast the moral good. Because of this, I don't think we're supposed to see Price's actions as always justified. I know I certainly didn't. Price has always been my favorite character in the series, but this is the most complex and least likable Price in the series, and I feel like that's intentional. They could have literally just made him the same generic hero, and this time I don't think they did. I think he's intended to make you feel uncomfortable, but he's also there to illustrate that such practicality can be effective. To shy away from that and assume that Farah's humanity first approach will always work is naive, even if it is still the moral stance someone like myself chooses to take. Again, it feels like this is really trying to paint gray areas like the developers spoke of repeatedly. Do you choose to look the other way when practicality is inhumane? Do you choose to stick to your morality even when it can lead to the suffering of more and more people? Do you draw a line somewhere in between? And if so, where and why? Giving players control over these moments in the context of a game can often be contrived. As I hopefully illustrated earlier, if the player can reach the same goal without being an inhuman asshole, most people are going to take that route. That doesn't deliver questions of morality versus practicality, because morality will always win. Mass Effect is the perfect example of this falling apart, because simply stacking your character with morality points means morality always works out for everyone. I never had to pay for any of my risky choices in Mass Effect 1, 2, or 3, as long as I was a true paragon. The choice is meaningless and doesn't leave the player asking questions or reflecting or anything. I didn't feel that way with Modern Warfare. I also had a strong reaction to the section where you're playing as young Farah after the gas attack, and you're crawling through a crack in a wall only to come across the body of a child. Sure, you could boil this down to, oh, they showed us a dead kid and shoved it in our faces for shock value. And you know what? Maybe I am stupid for choking up at that point. Maybe they got me and their cheap tactics manipulated me. All I know is that when that moment happened, I was looking at Hadir and horrified by his reaction. This moment isn't far from their house. It's more than likely they both knew this kid and were probably even friends with him. This to me came across as a strong tie back to who Hadir would eventually become. His father struggled to protect them. This other kid's parents couldn't protect him at all. In a matter of minutes, Hadir has nearly lost all things dear to him all at once, other than his sister. But what's more, he's now gotten it into his head that tough choices that may be morally gray or even outright wrong, are sometimes necessary to protect the things you value. I feel Hadir is who he is partially because of this moment here, and it impacted me not because dead kid is spooky sad, but because it succinctly translated and humanized the effects such atrocities can have on the survivors. It doesn't have to be a fictional, ridiculous Russian gas attack. What would you do if your best friend and many other people you cared for died in a suicide bombing when you were just a kid? Or for an example that's more relevant to most of my audience, what about a mass shooting? This is what Black Ops 2 tried to do with Menendez, but here it's comparatively quiet and subtle, despite literally throwing the body of a child in front of our faces. Subtlety often comes from what a story beat asks us to think about, not always the presentation of the moment itself. Again, the white phosphorus section in Spec Ops is anything but subtle in regards to most of its presentation, but that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of subtleties to it and its themes. I'm not saying that all of this means the game's story squarely succeeds in every regard, or that it's free from political problems and things that deserve being discussed, but I feel like the game is doing more than glorifying Western military powers, because I certainly got a lot more out of it. With all of that finally out of the way, it's time to close this series out. While the gameplay of Infinite Warfare isn't quite as varied or intimate as Modern Warfare 2019, it makes up for it with passion, focus, and polish. I may still end up liking Modern Warfare 2019 more than Infinite Warfare in the end, it's hard to say as of now. But regardless, in terms of the actual gameplay itself, I can definitely say Modern Warfare 2019 and Infinite Warfare are the strongest of the bunch. Despite what the pessimistic, often entitled, and poorly researched complaints would argue, the series has definitely improved in many ways over the years. There are rough patches, and a lot of the things the older games did are still great, but I'm happy with where Call of Duty has gone over the years. So what order would I rank these games in then? Which do I think is the weakest, and which is the strongest? And also, what do the in-betweens look like? Well, from weakest to strongest of the games we looked at, I'd say it goes a little something like this. Ultimately, I think a large part of this order comes down to the mechanical issues of the earlier titles. Some of them still transcend these problems in many ways, and I honestly would say all of them Black Ops 2 and higher, except for Ghosts, are at least totally solid experiences, despite the issues they can have. But I think ultimately the polish and execution of Infinite Warfare and Modern Warfare 2019 put them quite a ways above the others. Where most of the others are games I'd recommend playing if you just need a game to kill time, or wanted to see a bit of what made them special at release, I could currently recommend Modern Warfare 2019 and Infinite Warfare simply because they're great shooters. And with this exhausting project finally done, I welcome your seething comments of hatred. If you didn't hate what I had to say here for some inexplicable reason, let me know your extended thoughts below. Which Call of Duty games are your favorite and why? Is there anything in particular you disagreed with or agreed with here that you feel doesn't get the attention it deserves? What do you want to see from the series going forward? If you enjoyed this video or any of the individual videos in this series, I'd be incredibly grateful if you shared them with someone else that might find them interesting. Leave a like if you enjoyed, sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.